Before Walmart, before Amazon, there was Main Street where every handshake meant something, and the butcher knew your name. Storefronts lined both sides of the road, each one different but all part of a familiar rhythm. The bell over the door chimed as you stepped inside, and the scent of fresh bread or shaving cream or sawdust filled the air. These streets were more than places to shop. They were the heartbeat of small-town America, where business and belonging were woven tightly together. The butcher cut meat to order, wrapping it in thick white paper and marking the price in pencil across the top. The barber shop carried the buzz of clippers and the hum of conversation, where news traveled faster than the local paper. Five and dime stores stood at the center of it all, selling everything from sewing needles to candy bars. For families, these shops weren't just about convenience. They were about trust. Children could run errands with a few coins in their pockets, and if they came up short, a friendly nod from behind the counter often meant they could settle later. Running tabs were written in ledgers, and no one worried about signatures or cards. A person's word was enough. Every trip downtown was an experience. Neighbors stopped on sidewalks to catch up, leaning against brick walls and talking until the sun shifted higher in the sky. Store owners knew their customers' stories who had a baby on the way, who had just lost a job, who needed a little extra meat thrown in at no charge. Shopping was personal, and every purchase carried a human connection. These weren't transactions. They were relationships built over years. For children, Main Street was its own kind of playground. They darted between shops, dropping off notes from parents or picking up small bags of sugar or flour. The five and dime was a treasure chest where a nickel could buy a comic book or a candy that lasted the walk home. These little errands weren't chores. They were part of growing up, chances to feel trusted and independent while still wrapped in the safety of familiar faces. Even the buildings themselves carried a kind of warmth. Wooden counters worn smooth by years of use, glass display cases that caught the light, and handwritten signs in the windows gave every store a personality. They weren't designed by corporate architects. They grew out of the hands and hearts of local families. To walk down Main Street in those years was to feel rooted, surrounded by a sense of community that extended far beyond the storefronts themselves. But time doesn't stand still, and neither did America's way of shopping. It started with smaller, bigger stores, bigger parking lots. At first, it was exciting. Families piled into cars and drove a little farther than usual to see what these new spaces had to offer. The aisles were wider, the shelves taller, and the choices seemed endless compared to the cramped but familiar stores downtown. Shopping began to change in the 1960s and 1970s, and though no one realized it at the time, those first steps toward convenience would reshape communities across the country. These larger stores promised variety under one roof. Instead of visiting 3 or 4 different shops, families could pick up clothing, hardware, and groceries in a single trip. Parking lots made it easy to load bags directly into the trunk, a small but meaningful shift in how people thought about shopping. Prices were often lower too, and in an era where budgets mattered, families welcomed the savings. The appeal was obvious: more choices, less hassle, better value. Early versions of the superstore model began to take hold. Retailers studied efficiency, building bigger footprints and experimenting with layouts that encouraged shoppers to stay longer and spend more. Bright lighting, uniform signage, and larger selections felt modern, even futuristic. For many Americans, stepping into one of these new stores felt like stepping into progress itself. It was hard to resist the feeling that this was the future of shopping. But every step toward convenience carried an unseen cost. The pull of these stores drew shoppers away from the smaller businesses downtown. Where once people had walked from the bakery to the barber to the five and dime, now they drove past those familiar storefronts on their way to sprawling shopping centers outside of town. Foot traffic on Main Street began to thin, and the lively hum of neighborhood streets grew a little quieter. Still, in those early years, the shift didn't feel like a loss. It felt like gain. Families were dazzled by the abundance, the chance to fill their carts with everything they needed in one place. Children begged for toys from the newly stocked shelves. Parents appreciated the savings, and towns began to adjust to this new way of life. The emotional ties that once anchored shopping to community began to loosen, replaced by a growing attachment to price tags and convenience. In hindsight, it's clear that this was the first crack in the foundation of Main Street. These larger stores were not just places to buy goods. They were early signals of how consumer culture was changing. Yet even then, the giants hadn't fully moved to the outskirts. Before they built sprawling complexes beyond town, they first made their presence known right on Main Street itself. But before the giants claimed the edge of town, they quietly set up shop on Main Street itself. Woolworths had grilled cheese. Jack Penny had creaky floors. Even the chains, the big names that spread across towns, once felt like home. In the 1970s, Main Street still carried the weight of community, even when national brands began to anchor the center of town. Sears, Jack Penny, and Woolworths weren't faceless corporations in that era. They were part of the neighborhood, woven into daily life, just like the barber or the corner grocer. These stores blended with the local character in ways that might feel surprising today. A Woolworth lunch counter wasn't just a place to grab a quick sandwich, it was a meeting spot. A place where children sat on stools, sipping cherry sodas while parents caught up with friends. Jack Penny catalogs weren't only about ordering clothes. They were events in themselves. Family members gathering to circle items they hoped for at Christmas. Sears, with its endless supply of tools and appliances, became the place where new homeowners started building their dreams. The buildings themselves carried personality. Brick storefronts stood shoulder to shoulder with local shops. Narrow aisles filled with displays that felt personal, not uniform. Floors creaked beneath every step, reminding shoppers that the place had been walked on by neighbors for decades. The people working inside weren't strangers either. They were often locals, hired from the same community they served. A cashier at Sears or a waitress at Woolworths could be a familiar face from church, from school, or from down the block. Families grew loyal to these stores, not only for what they sold, but for the role they played in community life. Picking up a layaway item at Jack Penny meant bumping into classmates or neighbors. Woolworths wasn't just about shopping. It was about sitting shoulder to shoulder at the counter, sharing a meal with the same people you saw at Little League or choir practice. Even the act of flipping through a Sears catalog together felt more like a family ritual than a commercial task. There was an emotional attachment to these brands that went beyond products. They weren't yet the giants, standardized corporations they would later become. They were still rooted in the fabric of Main Street, small enough to feel personal, yet big enough to carry an air of modern promise. People trusted them because they still felt like an extension of the community. And memories of those moments, sharing a grilled cheese at Woolworths or unboxing a new appliance from Sears, still linger warmly today. But it wasn't long before these beloved names followed the money and the cars. The superstores didn't just sell more. They redefined what shopping meant in America. By the 1980s and 1990s, the rise of malls and sprawling shopping centers began reshaping the very landscape of towns and cities. What once centered on sidewalks, shop windows, and neighbors greeting one another now stretched into vast parking lots, leading to massive buildings that looked the same whether you were in Ohio, Texas, or California. Shopping had become standardized, and in that sameness something important was quietly lost. Inside, every detail felt carefully engineered. The layouts were uniform, designed to guide shoppers along wide aisles filled with bulk items stacked high. Quantity replaced familiarity, and speed became the new measure of success. Where once a clerk might pause to chat while wrapping a purchase, checkout now meant standing in long lines under fluorescent lights, scanning barcodes and moving along quickly. It was efficient, but it stripped away the small moments of connection that once made shopping personal. For families, these new spaces held undeniable appeal. They could find clothes, food, household goods, and entertainment all under one roof. Malls offered movie theaters, food courts, and long stretches of climate-controlled space to walk. Weekends shifted from strolling downtown streets to circling the mall with friends, browsing store after store that mirrored those in every other town. The variety was thrilling at first, the choices seemingly endless. Yet the experience was less about belonging and more about consumption. Parking lots replaced the sidewalks where neighbors once lingered. Instead of bumping into a friend on Main Street, shoppers now hurried across wide asphalt expanses to reach their cars. The rhythm of community life fractured as local shops struggled to compete with the low prices and sheer scale of the big box model. Small-town storefronts began to sit empty, their windows dark while the glow of neon signs lit up the edges of highways. It's easy to see why people embraced the change. Saving money and time mattered, and families often felt they were gaining something valuable. But behind the bright signs and discount tags lay a cultural loss that was harder to measure. The local flavor, the quirky uniqueness of independent shops, and the human warmth of face-to-face exchanges were steadily replaced by efficiency, scale, and uniformity. By the time superstores had cemented their place, the old ways of shopping felt like relics of another era. Children growing up in the age of malls and megacenters would never know the thrill of hearing a doorbell chime as they entered a shop where everyone knew their name. Progress brought convenience, but it came at the expense of identity and connection. And once the giants left, Main Street began to fade store by store, window by window. The barber closed. The bell on the door stopped ringing, and just like that, Main Street went quiet. The steady hum of life that once defined the center of town slowed until it was replaced by silence. Stores that had been in families for generations couldn't keep up with the shift toward malls and big box retailers. Without the steady stream of neighbors walking through their doors, many shopkeepers were left with little choice but to close. Some, it came with age. Owners who had run their shops for decades simply retired, with no one left willing to carry the weight of long hours and shrinking profits. Others were forced into bankruptcy, their dreams packed up along with their unsold goods. Empty buildings stood as reminders of what had been lost, each darkened window reflecting not just an end to business, but an end to a chapter of community life. The visual decay was impossible to ignore. Hand-painted signs faded in the sun, paint peeled from wooden frames, and once bright displays gathered dust behind locked glass. Sidewalks that had been busy with children carrying bags of candy or parents shopping for Sunday closed now echoed with nothing but the sound of the wind. For towns built around their main streets, the emptiness felt like a wound. The emotional toll ran deep. These weren't just businesses. They were gathering places where lives had intersected daily. The butcher remembered which child preferred an extra slice of bologna. The barber knew the stories behind every scar and wrinkle on the men who sat in his chair. To lose these shops was to lose shared memory, the collective heartbeat of a community. Childhood itself seemed to disappear along with them. The corner store where kids once bought popsicles on hot afternoons became just another shuttered building. Nostalgia filled the gap left behind. People remembered walking hand in hand with their parents down busy sidewalks, or the joy of saving up allowance to buy something small at the 5 and dime. But when they returned as adults, those places were gone, replaced by silence and faded paint. The ache of loss was mixed with gratitude for having lived through a time when such places still existed. Communities learned that it wasn't just about losing stores. It was about losing the web of connections those stores created. The decline of Main Street wasn't measured only in dollars and cents, but in friendships, traditions, and memories that no longer had a home. But it wasn't just stores we lost. It was something deeper. We gained speed, but lost our stories. Was it really worth it? The shift from the slow, familiar rhythm of Main Street to the fast-paced efficiency of big box stores and shopping centers promised progress, but it also carried an invisible price. What once felt like a conversation between neighbors became a transaction between strangers. The warmth of personal service gave way to the cold precision of efficiency. On Main Street, a clerk remembered your name, asked about your family, and set aside an item they knew you'd like. In the new world of retail, friendly clerks were replaced by hurried cashiers scanning items as fast as possible, or later by machines that required no human interaction at all. Customers got through lines quicker, but the simple joy of being recognized, of being part of a shared story, disappeared. Shopping became something to finish, not something to experience. Consumerism itself began to feel like a dehumanizing force. Stores grew larger, but people grew smaller inside them, anonymous faces in endless aisles. The sense of belonging that once came from community shops gave way to the isolation of pushing a cart under fluorescent lights. Even surrounded by crowds, many felt alone. The ritual of shopping, once tied to trust and connection, became focused on convenience and price, stripping away the deeper meaning it once carried. Traditions faded in the process. Holiday window displays, carefully decorated by local shopkeepers, once drew families downtown to marvel at the magic of the season. Now, decorations were mass-produced, identical from one chain store to the next. The creativity, the local flair, the personal touch that made Main Street special were replaced by uniformity. In chasing progress, towns gave up some of the very things that made them feel alive. The question that lingers is whether the trade was worth it. Faster service and lower prices are valuable, but they come at the cost of human connection. Main Street taught people that shopping could be more than buying. It could be about stories, relationships, and memories. Losing that meant losing part of the fabric of everyday life. Looking back, the price of progress wasn't just about empty storefronts. It was about the erosion of traditions, the quiet creep of loneliness, and the shift from being known to being counted. For many, that loss is still felt today, hidden beneath the hum of self-checkouts and the glow of big-box signs. And just when Main Street thought it couldn't get worse, something even bigger arrived. Then came Amazon, and the store in your town became a website. What once meant walking down Main Street or driving to the mall now meant typing on a keyboard and waiting for a package to land on the doorstep. The late 1990s and early 2000s brought a wave of e-commerce that reshaped American life with breathtaking speed. In just a few short years, shopping transformed from a physical ritual into a digital routine. The internet made everything feel limitless. No longer confined by store hours or inventory, consumers could browse catalogs of products at any time, from anywhere. With a few clicks, something that once required a trip across town could arrive at the door in days. The efficiency was undeniable, and for many, irresistible. Online shopping didn't just compete with local stores, it rewrote the entire rulebook. Legacy giants who had once ruled Main Street and malls suddenly faltered. Sears, the company that had delivered everything from houses to appliances through its iconic catalog, collapsed under the weight of iron competitors. Jack Penny, Woolworths, and other names that once anchored communities could not adapt fast enough. The same chains that had pushed out smaller local businesses now found themselves on the losing end of a battle against the digital tide. The change wasn't just about economics, it was about experience. Shopping had once been tactile, filled with the feel of fabric, the smell of leather, or the sound of conversation at the counter. Online shopping stripped all of that away. What remained was efficiency, but it came at the cost of connection. Clicking, add to cart, lacked the warmth of a shopkeeper who remembered your name or a neighbor you bumped into by chance. For most consumers, though, convenience won. The promise of lower prices, wider choices, and doorstep delivery outweighed tradition. People adjusted quickly to this new rhythm, and the memories of crowded malls or busy main streets began to fade. The culture of shopping as a community activity gave way to a solitary act, done behind screens and delivered in cardboard boxes. Local businesses were hit the hardest. Already struggling from decades of decline, they now face competition they couldn't possibly match. Family-owned shops that had survived the rise of malls often closed their doors when the internet became the default marketplace. The digital avalanche didn't just take away stores. It took away the fragile hope that small businesses might one day rebound. The shift felt final, as if the story of Main Street had reached its last page. But just as it all seemed lost, something surprising began to happen. A new generation is discovering the charm of old storefronts and breathing life into the past. After years of decline, something unexpected began to stir in small towns and cities across America. Younger families and entrepreneurs, tired of the sameness of chain stores and the isolation of online shopping, started looking backward to move forward. They saw potential in the weathered brick buildings, the creaky wooden floors, and the empty windows that once symbolized loss. Slowly, Main Street began to flicker back to life. The shop local movement grew out of this desire for authenticity. Farmers markets popped up in town squares, drawing crowds not just for fresh produce, but for the sense of community that came with it. Artisan shops opened in restored storefronts, selling handmade goods, baked bread, and crafts that carried a personal touch no big-box store could replicate. Every purchase felt more than transactional. It felt meaningful, like a vote for connection and tradition. Historic restoration projects became central to this revival. Towns invested in bringing back the charm of their old main streets, peeling away decades of neglect to reveal the beauty beneath. Neon signs were rewired, faded paint refreshed, and wooden counters polished until they gleamed again. For many, the sight of a once-abandoned shop lit up at night carried as much hope as any grand redevelopment project. Community events returned as well. Street fairs, parades, and seasonal celebrations began to draw families downtown, much like they once had in the 1960s and 1970s. Town squares filled with music and laughter, while children darted between stalls, just as their grandparents once had. The tradition of gathering in shared public spaces was reborn, proving that the hunger for belonging had never truly gone away. Nostalgia played a powerful role in shaping these choices. People longed for the experiences they had heard about or remembered faintly from childhood. The smell of fresh popcorn at a corner store, the sound of a doorbell chime, the pleasure of chatting with a shopkeeper who genuinely cared. Even those too young to have lived it firsthand felt drawn to the stories, wanting to reclaim a piece of that slower, simpler life. What emerged was not just a shopping trend, but a cultural shift. The pace of modern life made people crave slow living, where buying local wasn't just about products, but about values. Supporting a small business became a way of reinforcing community, of choosing connection over convenience. Main Street, once thought lost forever, began to prove it could still hold a place in American life, different, smaller perhaps, but deeply meaningful. Because no matter how much changes, one truth still holds. Main Street isn't just a place. It's a feeling, and in some towns, it's coming back to life. The faded signs, the creaky floors, the jingling bells on doors may not be as common as they once were, but the spirit they carried never truly disappeared. Main Street has always stood for more than shopping. It has stood for belonging, for the rhythm of everyday life that tied neighbors together. Even as malls and online stores rose, that memory remained, quietly waiting to be rediscovered. The story of Main Street is not one of complete loss, but of resilience. It reminds us that connection matters more than convenience. The butcher who knew your order, the shopkeeper who set aside something special, the neighbor you bumped into on the sidewalk. Those small moments were the true currency of Main Street. They were proof that commerce was never just about buying and selling. It was about people recognizing one another, sharing stories, and finding meaning in the ordinary. As America shifted towards speed and scale, it gave up much of that intimacy. Yet tradition has a way of holding on, even when buried under layers of change. Nostalgia alone isn't what brings people back downtown. It's the realization that human connection, once thought expendable, is actually essential. A restored storefront, a new farmer's market, or a revived holiday festival carries more weight than any discount sign because it reconnects people to a way of life they didn't to realize they were missing. Main Street, in that sense, has always been the heart of America. It beats not in the bricks or the windows, but in the relationships that unfold within them. When people choose to gather there, to shop there, to linger a little longer, they keep that heart alive. Its survival doesn't depend on scale. It depends on memory, on the stories we tell, and the value we place on the community. There is something deeply hopeful in knowing that even after decades of decline, Main Street still finds ways to adapt. It may never look exactly as it did in the 1970s, but its essence, the feeling of being known, of being part of something larger, remains timeless. The past doesn't vanish completely. It lives on in the spaces we protect, the traditions we revive, and the memories we share. Which of these vanished stores do you remember most? Share your memories in the comments below.